Good morning, everybody. As Keith mentioned, Ellen MacDonald and myself and a number of students really started working on this project years ago. Back in 2006, 2007, there was a lot of interest and concern about how that mountain pine beetle infestation is likely to affect hydrology of our east slopes watersheds in particular. Dan mentioned some of the focus on the east slopes watersheds, and so really we began this study probably 4 years ago now to look at how mountain pine beetle was likely to affect that hydrology, and at the same time look at how that's coupled with a bunch of questions around vegetation. So lots of folks in British Columbia experiencing that mountain pine beetle infestation, and hydrologists there being asked to model or project what those effects are likely to be. And one of the problems was we didn't have good information on how beetle and beetle attack affects a whole suite of processes that govern how water cycles in those forests. And so, the beetle's affecting a whole bunch of things that governs how water moves through that stand, and vegetation is a key component of this. So really, you can't uncouple the vegetation from understanding what's going on with water cycling. So it was a very natural marriage of sort of two disciplines, looking at water cycling and what's happening with vegetation in those stands. Our approach from the very beginning was also building on the BC experience. As the beetle attack was happening around them, one of the difficulties the scientists were having there is they were losing their reference sites to mountain pine beetle at the same time. So we took a very different approach in this particular study, and again, it's focused on the broad questions around how is mountain pine beetle attack likely to affect the hydrology and the water cycling of these stands, and does that really pose a threat to some of the hydrologic issues that we're concerned about? And at the same time, that's very tightly coupled to some questions around vegetation and fuels and understory vegetation dynamics. So really it's these two questions that this program is trying to tackle. Our approach from the get-go was not to wait for the beetle to produce that attack, but rather to simulate that attack using a herbicide to simulate kind of the crown scale effects of various levels of beetle attack. So looking at a couple of different levels of simulated beetle attack using glyphosate applied to individual trees. Also looking at, well, what would a salvage strategy look like? And so we've got some salvage treated units or some harvested units, and then, again, trying to compare all of those things to what's going on in a healthy, unattacked reference stand. That was the basic approach. The study was set up south of Hinton in the Robb area, and this is a large land or stand scale, or a large scale kind of study. The approach of this study is really a process-based approach, whereby we're looking at the key processes that govern water cycling and understory vegetation dynamics. We applied herbicide at an individual tree level to stands of trees, and where's that to stands of trees, and so what we did was two different levels of herbicide application. One where all of the trees were killed, one where 50% of the trees were killed, and then we have a salvage comparison and a reference comparison. So all of those four treatments applied to over 2 hectare plots or stands, if you will, up in this region, and then replicated down in this region here and this region here. So we've got both replicated and then before-after control treatment design structures to look at this. The study was started back in early 2008, and really it was following or before the treatments were applied. We studied these dynamics in these stands prior to the application of the treatments, and then followed these through 2 complete growing seasons after the application of the treatments. So really the story here is one that's told by Pablo Pina. He's a PhD student working on the water cycling part, and Anne McIntosh, who's doing the understory dynamics. Ellen and I are here just for context at the front end and the back end. So we got Pablo to come up here and tell you about what he's learned about water cycling in these forests.
Thanks, Uldis. So as Uldis mentioned, the basic question of my research is about understanding the water relations in the lodgepole pine forest under a mountain pine beetle root attack scenario. And to do so, we analyzed the forest water cycle through a top-down vertical water balance approach, where basically we have gross precipitation and evaporative demand, meaning rain and climate, acting over the forest. So we have a rain, where the rain is going to reach first some components of the forest, the canopy, leaves, branches, trunks, and the forest floor as well. So part of the water being stored and lost, subsequently lost in terms of evaporation, is going to be known in here as both canopy interception and forest floor interception. Another component of this framework is the transpiration from the tree, here known as overstory transpiration. And the footprint of all these components, canopy and forest floor interception and transpiration, is going to be reflected in the soil storage component as soil moisture storage component dynamics. Just a quick snapshot of how does the upper foothills environment look like. I don't want you to pay any clear attention to this graph before I walk you through it. So here, I think this is a clear summary of, from the hydrological point of view, how does this environment look like. The main ideas for this graph is showing in green soil moisture or water available for the trees, and in green and the precipitation events, meaning rain as rainfall and not snowfall events in blue. So the main idea here is to show that the periods of frozen soil and snowfall have a subsequent, a substantial length in the year span of these kind of systems. And the latter part of these components generate a subsequent or have a critical role in the soil moisture recharge dynamics of this kind of system. So the upper foothills is considered as a snow melt or spring melt dominated system. So that's pretty important to recognize. There is, yeah, indeed, a relationship in the rain period, in the rainfall period, with the soil moisture storage or soil moisture recharge, meaning that you have a rain event, you will have an increase in the soil moisture. However, most of the time, the soil moisture is going to respond positively to the rain only for events about larger than 8 millimeters in size, which means that only infrequent events in terms of rain are going to have a relationship with the soil in this kind of environments. And the last idea is that there is no clear seasonality of the distribution of the rain in this kind of environments, meaning that the rain, you can have a fairly concentrated event in the spring or in throughout the entire season. It's fairly randomly distributed, but you have a clear difference in terms of precipitation from snow, slow intensity events, and rain, high intensity events. Now, what kind of scenarios can we expect with the mountain pine beetle attack? Well, in the hydrological cycle, well, if we have the increase in tree mortality, we will have a decrease or an increase in the canopy, an increase in canopy openness, which means that the forest canopy is not going to be able to hold water or store water, even a rain event. So we will have a decrease in the canopy interception capacity of the forest, which will mean more water reaching the forest floor as net precipitation. We will have dead trees, so we will have a decrease in the transpiration component on a forest or standstill basis. And of course, because more water is reaching the forest floor, we will have an increase in the water being lost as interception, and presumably an increase in the soil and water reaching the soil. Now, how did we measure or analyze the interception? We measured the amount of water going through the canopy as through flow. We measured the water flowing through the trunks of the trees as stem flow, and we measured the water flowing through the forest floor and reaching the mineral soil as recharge into the mineral soil. So these are this is a series of the components that we obtain from the interception. And in the left axis, y-axis, we have rain events. In the positive region, we represent rain events. Negative region means the events that are actually reaching the mineral soil. And in the right y-axis, we have the cumulative trace of the interception components. Okay? So in light blue, I'm showing the trace of the cumulative total forest interception, which pretty much is the sum of the canopy interception and the forest floor interception. So as you can see, for 1 year, this is the series for 2010, the total forest was able to, the total forest interception was up to 70% of the rain that reached the forest in 1 year, meaning that only from the total rain in 1 year, only 30% of the rain was able to reach the soil in a typical year. For the transpiration, we analyzed, we studied transpiration on a 3 individual basis using the thermal dissipation technique. And we had 2 basic questions in here. The first one is, how does a tree die? And it might sound quite basic, but the only research that we were able to find regarding fading rates or dying rates from trees is mainly associated to drought and crops, right? So it's not typically an unexplored question on what is the response of, are the trees physiologically active, even that they are considered dead or not? And the other response is there an actual differential response from live trees that are in a partially attacked stand? Meaning that these are healthy trees, we have a healthy tree that are in a mountain pine beetle attack stand. So this question is, we took this question as whether if there is a compensatory response from remaining live trees. So here I'm showing the time series of 2010 year, and we have the conditions of reference control, millimeters per day basis. Partially attacked stand represents, happy green represents these live trees, healthy unattacked trees in a partially attacked stand, and the sad red represent dying trees. And as you can see, there is a clear seasonal response throughout the year, right? Meaning that these three tree conditions are having the same coupling with the atmospherical drivers. They're showing a seasonal behavior. However, there is a shift only in terms of the magnitude of the response. So the transpiration rate is different. However, you can see a clear difference in the tree conditions, where the trees that are live in a partially attacked stand, they are actually transpiring more, presumably given an increase in soil moisture. And the trees that are dying, they're still physiologically doing something, right? So it's pretty important to consider this. Now, if we want to understand transpiration on a forest basis, given the evidence shown before, well, the stands, partially attacked stands, are composed of these kind of trees. Are trees that are live and presumably transpiring more, trees that are dying but still physiologically doing something, and trees that are dead and presumably doing nothing, right? So this is just an exercise of playing with the proportion of trees found in stands, partially attacked stands. So we had scenarios considering, okay, we're going to see transpiration on a forest basis or stand basis where 75% of the trees are going to be alive as A, then 50% of the trees alive as B, and C 25. And this is a graph showing the transpiration per day basis, where the x-axis shows the control relationships and the y-axis the exercise with the partial attack stand. And any departure from this region means a significant difference from control conditions. So as you can see, in order to expect a significant difference from a partial attack stand, you will expect that 50%, about 50% of your trees might have to be alive, right? So the system, what it says, this analysis, that the system might be fairly resilient in order to show a change from transpiration in a forest basis, and you have to consider the composition of your forest in this regard. So here I'm just showing the numbers are too small, but it's pretty much the same, and it shows the totals per season, right? And it's the same message. And actually there's a problem in the format. So overall, the water balance, we have that the main component in the water balance in this forest is by far the total forest interception at 70%. The main component of this was the canopy interception at 48%, and the forest floor is still fairly neglected in the literature. has a substantial effect here as 34%, and the overstory transpiration being only 16% in the water balance. Now, do we see a footprint with this relationship in the soil moisture? Well, you better go to this workshop if you want to find that out. So, that was Anne's turn.
All right, yeah, so I'm Ann McIntosh, and I'm working on my PhD with Dr. Ellen MacDonald. And I'm just going to touch very briefly on my aspect of the project. Originally, I was looking at what are the effects of mountain pine beetle early red attack on the vegetation and the fuels and the below ground dynamics. And I might give you a clue that based on what I found, that I've ended up changing it rather than what are the effects, is really how resistant are these stands in the short term. Because as you're going to see, I haven't really seen a lot of changes yet 1 year post-treatment. And this is, of course, going to be very different for this mountain pine beetle disturbance agent compared with what we might expect to find with, say, salvage logging or a fire, which is going to make changes in a much more rapid fashion. So, as I mentioned, I looked at all these different aspects, the plant community, the below ground aspects of this study. I looked at the microbes, the nutrients, that kind of thing, those and the fuels. And I'm not going to touch on those really today because of constraints of time, and as Pablo mentioned, we'd really like to see you come to our workshop on Monday and find out in much greater detail about those. So today I'm just going to touch very briefly on some of my findings in terms of what is the future regeneration potential of these stands. There we go. So first though, I will just touch briefly in terms of the understory vegetation community. Here on the y-axis we have percent cover, and on the x-axis we have the different treatments broken out by the year, the before year, the treatment year, the post-treatment year. And here in the middle we have the two different levels of simulated mountain pine beetle attack. And the take-home message here basically is that we don't really see any differences between the control and those two different levels of red attack. And this probably isn't so surprising because at this stage the needles are still on there. They're actually just turning red in our stands. So we don't have a big change in the light, which we would expect is a big driver of these plant communities. Where we do see the changes, again, of course, where we're going to expect it, is a big decrease in those salvage log stands as a function of the management that's gone on there. So last year I talked a little bit at the workshop about a germination study that I'd done, and I looked at just the findings in terms of 1 year out post-treatment in these attack stands. And I looked at these 5 different substrates and their potential to regenerate lodgepole pine, because that is, of course, the huge question that we're wanting to know. Well, what's the future of these forests? You know, there's no lodgepole pine advanced regeneration in these stands. I was originally going to do a study looking at advanced regeneration in these stands, and I couldn't even really struggle to find 5 trees per hectare in some of my stands, so I couldn't even really look at that adequately. So that's a huge concern, and that's what I wanted to address in this study was then, well, what is the future potential of regeneration? So I looked at 5 different substrates. I looked at different depths of litter. I looked at mineral soil, moss, because of course these are forest floors dominated by feather mosses, as well as decayed wood. And then I monitored the germination. And what you saw last year was, again, so here on the y-axis we have mean number of germinants counted. You can see we had very low number of germinants, which is what we'd expect in a natural study based out in the field. And then we have our 4 different treatments, and again, and here we have the 5 different substrates. And last year what we saw was this potential pattern for the wood in brown and the mineral in that weird yellowy green color. What we saw was maybe a signal that there might be better regeneration, and there might actually be some regeneration in the 100% attack stands. However, what we found when we went back 1 year out to see, well, what was the overwinter survival, now we can see no longer do we see sort of that future hope for regeneration in the short term, because the wood and the mineral soil have decreased back down in terms of the mean number of germinants that survived. And so what we need to think, though, is this is just strictly in the short term, and we have to think about over the longer term, well, what's the hope in these forests? Right now, in these forests, there isn't really a lot of mineral soil, and so what we need to do is wait for those trees to fall down, and I know there's a talk coming up later on in the workshop talking about when do these trees fall down. And then, of course, there's going to be more light reaching the forest floor, there's going to be more available mineral resources, which will be good news, hopefully, for future regeneration. Okay, so I'm going to just have Ellen MacDonald finish up.
Yeah, so on time. Excellent. Okay, so I'll just recap a little bit of our main findings and then carry on to where we're going in the future with this. Oops. So main findings for stand hydrology, first of all, that stand evapotranspiration depended on the level of attack. 100% attack and salvage logged obviously reduced the stand respiration, although there was some evidence that maybe fading or almost dead trees still did have some transpiration activity. What was interesting was that in the 50% killed stands, the trees that were still alive in those stands could compensate. So there was more soil moisture available, presumably, in those stands, and then the trees that were remaining alive were able to compensate for that, and so they actually ended up transpiring more. In terms of the soil moisture, there was a clear signal. Pablo didn't show it, but there was a clear signal of increased soil moisture in the surface 20 centimeters, and at the 5 centimeter there was a gradient with our treatments. So the treatments did, in fact, result in an increase in soil moisture as a reflection of the impacts on transpiration. There was regional effects too, and on the workshop on Monday, Pablo's going to be talking about scaling up to some regional level. In terms of the understory vegetation part, the overstory, the trees are dying as expected from our treatments. We didn't see any change in the understory communities yet. The regeneration seems like in the short term the opportunities for natural regeneration are really limited. Even in the microsites that we expected to be good or initially showed some potential, the decayed wood and the mineral soil or the shallow layers of LFH, where we expected there to be a possibility for regeneration. Even after a year, the regeneration was really poor, probably as a result of low light. And so we have to probably, to see natural regeneration, we're going to have to wait a little longer till there's more light, till more of the needles have been lost, and there's some natural microsites appearing as a result of tree falls, or create some microsites for regeneration. The below ground dynamics, although there was evidence of increased soil moisture and in the salvage logging some evidence potentially of a nutrient flush associated with that, there hasn't been any changes in the microbial communities yet. So really, in terms of the understory, it seems like it's just resistant in the short term anyways, and in the longer term we'll see what happens. As we move to the gray attack stage, we're anticipating the colors here. The red ones are the responses that we've already seen, and the yellow are the responses that we expect to see. So we've already seen a decrease in transpiration. As the needles begin to fall, we anticipate that interception will also be decreased. We've already seen an increase in soil water, and we expect to see more increase in soil nutrients and light as the needles are lost. And this should result in some kind of response in the understory community in terms of species-specific responses to the release of above ground and below ground nutrients, some change in that community. That could contribute to recovering the water balance, so the understory vegetation can be an important part of the hydrologic recovery of the stands as well, and the community may change. At the same time, we're probably going to see changes in the below ground communities and processes in the nutrient fluxes and soil moisture interacting with one another. Together, these are going to influence the forest future development, and we don't know exactly how. If the understory is resistant, then it could, or even if it changes in certain ways, it could actually interfere and hamper further the possibilities for natural regeneration of pine, even in a condition where the light conditions might become more favorable. So it's very interesting to see how in the longer term what will be happening. So right now in the project we're at a monitoring stage. So this coming summer we're just going to be monitoring the conditions in the stand, and we plan to do that, or hope to do that, have funding to do that for 2 or 3 more years. And as we see the trees sort of begin to move to the gray attack stage, then we'll launch another more major sampling and analysis to see what the slightly longer term responses are. So again, just a reminder about the workshop on Monday in the morning. We'll be presenting a half-a-day version of this half-hour talk with a lot more details, and we really like to have good participation and enter into discussions about how these findings can be applied to inform responses to mountain pine beetle. And then in the afternoon will be the TRIA project. So it's in this beautiful new building, the very colorful one right over there, the Edmonton Clinic Health Academy. So I encourage you to attend that, and just thanks to the sponsors of the research.